Hi, it's Dwyer. It is March 22nd, 2025. Let's talk about George Foreman, who passed away yesterday. Right now, let me make a few points. I'm really someone who doesn't see himself as a historian, right? The reason why I talk about history is because I feel sometimes it's being misrepresented, right? I think it's really important for us to record the facts. So let me just say, one of the things that shocked me as I've gotten older is how, after you live through an era and you see a Jim Rice or a Dave Parker or a Dick Allen or a Michael Irvin or a Terrell Owens, and you understand in the moment what everyone understands in the moment, that this guy is a Hall of Famer. I'm shocked that when the guy actually comes up for Hall of Fame voting, in the case of Jim Rice, Dave Parker, Dick Allen, they had to wait several years to get in the Hall of Fame. I'm also shocked that in the case of the Playmaker, that was the nickname, the Playmaker, Michael Irvin, and T.O., who was, in my eyes, one of the top 5 receivers in history. Incredibly, there's a group out there that did not make obvious first ballot Hall of Famers like them, Hall of Famers. Right? So I'm older. I feel a need to make sure that there's at least my recollection on film, right? On a YouTube video. So people who are skeptics, folks who are looking at Jim Rice's numbers and who are thinking, wow, this guy's an obvious Hall of Famer, can actually have a video to actually hear from someone who, I was a Yankee fan, I am a Yankee fan, right? I remember much of the Red Sox team, right? Mike Torres, Rick Burleson, Jim Rice, Fred Lynn, right? Who can actually hear from someone who lived through the era. So let's talk about George Foreman, because you're going to hear a lot of different stories. And people will talk about him and, they might not remember who he was. Now, Foreman was the second heavyweight champion that I became aware of. When I became aware of boxing, the baddest man on the planet was Smoking Joe Frazier. Right? Just understand. I know we don't understand how unbeatable Frazier seemed at the time. Frazier seemed unbeatable. Now, I was from a very progressive family. Father was a social worker. You would have thought the champion was Muhammad Ali. Right? Frazier fought Ali. Frazier beat Ali convincingly. That first fight is not close. Frazier even gets the knockdown in the first fight. Right? Different America. You had a lot of people protesting. Let's just say a lot of people were shocked with the result. So then you had one of the shocking fights in history. And looking back, it shouldn't have been shocking. Right? Foreman's a lot bigger than Smoking Joe. Foreman was unbeaten. Foreman himself was an Olympic gold medalist. They fought in Jamaica, and Foreman destroyed Joe Frazier. Now, I need for people to understand that George Foreman in the 1970s, right, because he's the second heavyweight champ I was aware of, I vividly remember his personality. He was a different person in the 1970s. Right? Let me just say, too, that while Smoking Joe tried to be friendly, right? You got the feeling Smoking Joe was kid-friendly, right? I was a little kid. So, I would see Joe Frazier interviews and I was interested in what the champ had to say. And the champ was friendly. The champ knew that there were fans who, were waiting for the interview. You didn't get the feeling George Foreman was even kid-friendly. Folks, this was the Sonny Liston interpretation of being heavyweight champion. Right? Foreman looked like he didn't like the press. Right? Foreman looked like the mean guy on your block who kids knew not to go near the guy's yard. If someone hit the ball over on the guy's lawn, nobody wanted to go get it. Right? This was the tough guy, and it didn't look like an act. So Foreman's international, right? He travels to Asia for a fight. He fights Kenny Norton, I believe in Venezuela or someplace like that. He's a dominant champion. Not only is he winning the fights, he's doing so by stoppage. Now let me say that the Foreman persona was different than Mike Tyson in the 80s. Tyson always came across like, he had his tongue in his cheek. Right? Either that or he was clueless. But you didn't get the feeling that Tyson, who was fearsome in the ring, was fearsome outside of the ring. You got that feeling with George Foreman. So then you have, after the Joe Frazier shocker, and Foreman destroying people like Kenny Norton, then you have the Rumble in the Jungle. Right now, let's remember the era well. Ali wins the fight, right? I would argue Foreman fought the wrong fight. I would argue that's a one-off fight. That's a bad night that unfortunately got locked in for George Foreman for eternity. Right? But make no mistake, leading into that fight, I can tell you people were afraid, people in my family, that Ali would get killed or maimed in the fight. Right? The feeling was that Ali wouldn't be the same coming out of the fight. Understand, Ali was an old man compared to Foreman. Right? Ali's from the 60 Olympics. Foreman's from the 68 Olympics. Right? Ali also wasn't exactly setting the world on fire. Right? Understand, Ali's having rough and tumble fights with people like Ken Norton, who Foreman destroyed. But understand, implicit in the fear that Ali fans had of Ali getting badly hurt because the fight looked like a mismatch going in, was the idea that Foreman was the kind of guy who, against an Ali, a beloved figure, right, against an Ali, the feeling was that Foreman had the mindset to hurt him. Right? This wasn't the guy who was going to take his foot off the accelerator if he had Ali badly hurt. Right? The feeling was, looking back, this is a retroactive feeling, was that Foreman was an Ivan Drago type guy. Remember that guy from a Rocky movie? The guy who kills Apollo Creed. Right? The feeling was that Foreman had that mindset. He came across as that ferocious. Well, understand, Foreman had a guy in front of him he should have beaten him. We analyze boxers here on YouTube. Just understand, Foreman should have beaten Ali. Right? He was surprised. The world was surprised. that anyone would actually go over to the ropes. Ali's corner was surprised that Ali, after the first round, Ali doesn't rope-a-dope in the first round. Ali comes out and is trying to engage George Foreman. Right? Foreman falls for it. A free-for-all breaks out. Right? It's later that Ali then finds himself over by the ropes. Now, had Foreman, and boxing history hinges on this, had Foreman, who you knew at that point, think about the best heavyweights of the 1970s, right? Smoking Joe, Ken Norton. Foreman had destroyed both, right? Neither guy makes it to the fourth round. You knew that Foreman was the baddest man on the planet. Here, Foreman has a guy in his 30s who can't stay in the middle of the ring with him. Right? Foreman wouldn't allow Ali to move away from him. Right? Ali doesn't have the legs to dance around Foreman. This is 74, not 67. So what does Foreman do? He does the one thing that would cost him the fight. Ali goes over by the ropes, and Foreman follows him over there. You would have thought this was Joe Joyce against Derek Chisora. Right? Foreman's the champ. Ali has to take his title. Ali can't fight you in the middle of the ring. Stay in the middle of the ring. What's Ali going to do? Knock you out? This is big bad George Foreman. Well, Foreman throws himself out. It's not like he had to. I want people to think about the best jabs in the heavyweight division since 1960. We'll make it so it covers the Foreman era. George Foreman has one of the best jabs in the heavyweight division. Why isn't Foreman just standing outside and throwing a jab? Why is he ever throwing hooks on Ali? Understand, Ali is up on the ropes. Now, truth be told, the film is more complicated. Ali is a gifted counterpuncher, and Ali is landing counters with his back up against the ropes against George Foreman. The question is, why is Foreman over by the ropes round after round against him? Right? All Foreman had to do was back away. All he had to do was wave to Ali to come fight him. Again, they're not equals. Foreman is the heavyweight champion. The crowd's an Ali crowd in Africa. That tells you how hated Foreman was. Right? But the crowd's not in the ring with the fighters. Foreman's the champion. What's he doing pursuing Ali? So then Foreman starts to slow down. He throws punches the whole time. Right? Now, there's a backstory here. Foreman's mentor literally was Sonny Liston. Foreman's a guy who trained with Liston. Understand, Ali moved away from Sonny Liston. Right? The first fight, Liston loses his title on his stool. Right? That's after, by the way, an interesting sequence where Ali asked Dundee to cut off the gloves because Liston supposedly had put something on his gloves during the fight to blind Ali. Right? The footage is compelling because you have an Ali who's blinded, who's up by the ropes with Sonny Liston pursuing him. And Liston still can't hit him flush. So understand, Foreman is in against a guy who's an Olympian like Foreman who beat his mentor twice. Right? Get the full dynamic here. So Foreman, who had foot speed when he was younger, is not going to allow Ali to move away from him. That was a mistake. So Ali catches Foreman. And Foreman is bone tired and he hits the canvas. And the referee, in my opinion, you look at the tape yourself. And one of the keys to looking and thinking about boxing is to actually look at the tape yourself. The folklore sometimes doesn't match the tape. The referee counts to 9. Foreman looks at his corner. Gil Clancy, great trainer, right? You know, when you're knocked down, people want you to clear your head. Because everyone understands that if you get up and you stagger, like Zab Judah did against Costa Zoo, the ref might wave off the fight. So you want to use at least 8 of the seconds. Make sure your head's clear so when you get up, you don't stagger. Here, the ref counts to 9. Foreman is off the canvas in my eyes, and the ref waves it off. Now, it's important because these moments make history, right? Ali couldn't do a rope-a-dope against Foreman in a rematch. Foreman in a rematch would realize he could just throw a jab, keep Ali outside of him, right? Ali's not going to be able to lead with power shots against George Foreman, right? So understand, when you're thinking of the heavyweight division in the 1970s, from a boxing perspective, let's forget what actually happened, and obviously, knockouts count, right? A guy knocks you out, a guy beats you, he takes your title, right? Obviously, knockouts count. Ali beat Foreman. Okay, we get it. The real question from the 1970s, if you're asking the question of who was the best heavyweight of the decade, knowing that Foreman stops, not just beats, stops Joe Frazier, stops Kenny Norton, stops Ron Lyle. And folks, understand, none of the men I've named, none of them make it to the later rounds. The only question of the 1970s is whether a prime Foreman would beat a prime Larry Holmes. Now, I know that's not the way the world sees it, right? We think of the 70s and we think of Ali, right? No one seems to care or realize that Foreman actually fought Frazier a second time, right? That fight took place at Nassau Coliseum. Look it up. And Foreman, this is after Foreman had lost his title, Foreman again beats Joe by stoppage. Joe doesn't make it to the later rounds. This is the Joe Frazier who is blood and guts with Ali, right? First fight, 15 rounds. Second fight, 12 rounds, right? Third fight, 15 rounds, right? Ali couldn't stop Joe Frazier. Joe Frazier couldn't make it to the second half of fights against George Foreman. Foreman is one of the absolute best fighters of the 1970s. Don't get lulled into, thinking or judging fighters in terms of how long of a reign they had. Right? Think of it differently. How good was this fighter? Right? It's a ironic part of history that, to me, one of the absolute best heavyweights of the 1960s, Sonny Liston, was then overlooked, right, after the rematch with Ali. Right, the first fight, Sonny is unprepared. He's the first heavyweight champion to give up his belt on his stool. The second fight, Jersey Joe Walcott, former champion, blows the refereeing, blows the count. No one in the 60s loved Sonny Liston, right? You can imagine the later part of the 60s, no one's fighting Liston. Liston goes to Europe. He's that desperate for matches. Look at the 1970s, right? The Foreman-Ron Lyle fight is a moment in time because you had Foreman, think about that fight, fighting in Ron Lyle's backyard. That fight's in Colorado. Right? Foreman has to go to Ron Lyle. You actually had a contender willing to fight George Foreman. And while Ron Lyle looked like Ron Lyle, right, he drops Foreman twice in the fight. Second knockdown, Foreman hits the canvas face first. Foreman clears his head and knocks out Ron Lyle. Nobody would touch Foreman. Right? Then Jimmy Young fights Foreman. Young, of course, one of the best defensive fighters I've seen. Right? In my opinion, Foreman's winning that fight. But then Foreman, of course, is overcome by heat exhaustion. Right? He's not the first guy, folks. The great Sugar Ray Robinson was overcome by heat exhaustion in his fight against Hall of Famer Joey Maxim. Right? That's the fight where Foreman falls to the canvas. Please look at a film of the fight. You need to ask yourself whether Foreman is popped and dropped or whether Foreman's just so bone tired that you and I could have blown on him and Foreman would have hit the canvas. Well, of course, Foreman doesn't win that fight. That's when he goes into the locker room, and because he's exhausted, if you believe his corner, or because, in fact, the spirit saw a lost soul, Foreman then believes that he finds Jesus. Well, let me just say, then you get a remarkable thing that happens. Right? Now, understand, as a kid, young kid, in the 70s, I knew Foreman wasn't a role model. Right? But yet there's another part of Foreman. Understand, Foreman's friends with Joe Louis. Foreman's corner had some of the best punchers in boxing history. They tell you about Willie Pep. You don't know much about the guy who beat Willie Pep multiple times, the great Sandy Sadler. He was in Foreman's corner. Of course, the old mongoose, Archie Moore, the man who drops Rocky Marciano in a heavyweight title fight, only to have the ref wipe Marciano's gloves, Marciano clear his head, and then later take out Archie Moore. Right? Understand, Archie Moore was the light heavyweight, there's no cruiserweight division, who jumps up to heavyweight to fight Rocky Marciano and later fight Muhammad Ali. Right? Just understand, Archie Moore had seen a lot. Right? Archie Moore, ironically, beats Joey Maxim to get the title. He was in Foreman's corner. Right? Foreman learns Liston's jab. Foreman learns Archie Moore's defense. So Foreman makes a comeback. Now let's not kid ourselves. I know we used to joke about Foreman fighting tomato cans. Folks, Foreman fought Jerry Cooney on his comeback. Look up that fight. Look at the end of that fight. That's a great head fake. Foreman comes across the ring. Cooney had been knocked down. Cooney has to make a decision. Which hand is Foreman throwing? Cooney picks the wrong hand. Foreman knocks him out. Right now, I don't say this lightly. Foreman never fights Larry Holmes. We don't know who the best was of the 1970s. Larry Holmes is still alive. Understand, Larry Holmes is on record as saying he felt Foreman dodged him. Right? I hope the press talks to Larry. Well, sadly, the 1970s, Foreman's death kind of marks the end to that era, right? Because Frazier's no longer with us. Ali is no longer with us. Norton is no longer with us. Ernie Shavers recently died. Ron Lyle is no longer with us. Larry Holmes is, folks, he is a boxing treasure. People need to pick his brain. Understand, Larry Holmes had to beat Ken Norton to become heavyweight champ. Larry Holmes was the sparring partner for Ali. Right? He is well situated. Larry Holmes, quite frankly, should have lost his title to Ernie Shavers. Shavers drops Holmes in the rematch. Holmes was lucky to have the opportunity to clear his head that Foreman got against Ron Lyle, but did not get against Ali. So we get to Foreman's return. And I'll just say this. There are very few times where I look at an athlete and I think to myself, wow, I need to learn from this athlete on how to live my life. Right? The Foreman who came back is a treasure for anyone looking for a father figure. And I had a great father, right? Or an uncle, right? I considered Foreman to be like an uncle. For my eyes, one of the great coincidences in history, and it's a great coincidence, was there was a fighter, Genaro Hernandez. He was actually one of, the better champions at the time. Pretty good fighter. He was a great guy, too. He gave an interview to the Orange County Register where he talked about how, despite being a successful boxer, he had a hard time qualifying for a mortgage, right? Genaro Hernandez was the kind of guy who, wanted to help people outside the ring. So we had a very tough defense. It was against a young guy who was jobbed at the Olympics. His name was Floyd Mayweather. Now, if you're into boxing, I encourage people to look up the film. It's Genaro Hernandez, and I'm saying his name because he was the champ. And in boxing, there's a tradition. You say the champion's name first. I don't care who's the better fighter, right? The champ is the guy who gets his name mentioned first. It was Genaro Hernandez against Floyd Mayweather, right? Now, Mayweather was headstrong, and Mayweather comes in the ring wearing some gear that made it look like he was the champion. No, the other guy was the champion. The important thing for this story is that by coincidence, the ring boxing analysis, the boxing analyst on the program was George Foreman. And Foreman draws your attention to Mayweather's feet. And you see Mayweather coming in the pocket and then leaving the pocket systematically. Coming in the pocket and then leaving the pocket. Right? It's a great moment. Mayweather wins the title. He does it emphatically. But understand, in that moment, George Foreman, who was excellent, I mean excellent, as a boxing analyst, I know he sounds loopy and stuff like that. The stuff he's saying is remarkable. He draws the fans into a part of Mayweather's game that doesn't even get attention. Right after that fight, I started keying on people's footwork. Right? Let's just say, too, Foreman, when he comes back, had a lot to say that he didn't say in the 70s. Right? He had some controversial comments about the Rumble in the Jungle. We won't go into them here, but just understand Foreman claims that he was told he couldn't leave the country and things like that. Foreman also talks about being a young guy, and this is real important. Right? And he's in the 5th Ward of Houston, the rough part of town. Right? The rough part of town. And he robs someone. Then he and his friend hear police sirens in the background. His friend runs off, and Foreman, young guy, right, young guy, who's not far removed from just a couple years later waving the American flag at the Olympics. Foreman sees his friends running, and Foreman looks at the friend, and Foreman says, "Why are you running?" "All we did was rob this guy's money." Right? Folks don't understand. Folks don't understand how isolated and how lost some young men are. Right? George Foreman admits that in that moment, his view of the world was, survival of the fittest. Right? Might makes right. He didn't even think that what he was doing at the time was wrong. Well, understand, Foreman has a lot of stories like that. When he came back, the biggest part of Foreman's comeback, apart from the fact that he actually beats a damn good fighter in Michael Moore, right? The fact that he's in there roughing up Evander Holyfield, who could not drop him. Right? Understand, Foreman fights Shannon Briggs, a guy who today Lennox Lewis says is the hardest puncher he ever faced. And Foreman goes the distance. Why couldn't these young guys take out the old man? And I mean old, right? Foreman is in his 40s for part of his comeback. Well, understand, it's the stories Foreman told when he came back in interviews that people really need to key on. He talks about Sonny Liston. Now understand, Foreman himself, arguably the scariest heavyweight champ I've ever seen. Right? As I said, kids know this intuitively. You know the adults who don't like kids. Foreman, for me, was one of those people. I'm sure he has another side. I know he was a father and all this other stuff, right? But just understand, Foreman was one of those adults who, heavyweight champ or not, if you're a little kid, you kind of knew the persona. This guy's not kid friendly. Right? Well, by Foreman standards, Sonny Liston was a tough man. And Foreman tells a story about how he's with Sonny and Foreman has the newspaper out. And Foreman gives Liston the newspaper. And Liston moves away from it. It's then that Foreman claims he understood that Sonny Liston, a heavyweight champion, could not read. Right now, for me, black male, these stories are important. You need to know what's happening behind the scenes. You need to have an idea of the life people are living, whether you would want to live that life, the mistakes people have made, and how you could correct those mistakes. Right? I was a kid who, when I was around older people, and guys started, talking about the mistakes they made, I'd be all ears. I'd want to hear. Right? Not because I wanted to, write a book on the guy. No. I wanted to hear so I could learn. The Foreman who comes back is one of the most compelling people I know of. I didn't say athlete. He's one of the most compelling people I know of. Let me say this diplomatically too, especially for the old timers. In the 70s, we have an idea of who made big money and who didn't. Right? You understood that Ali was, whoever was champ, Ali was the cash cow of the division. Right? You understood that. You wanted a box office, get Ali. Right? You understood that Frazier's run is over by the middle of the 1970s. Right? He loses to Foreman in 72. The Thriller in Manila is 75. Right? You understood that Ken Norton fought a lot of guys. Right? Frazier wouldn't fight him because, as Frazier said, they actually sparred together. Right? Frazier understood Norton was tough. Right? Norton fights Foreman. Norton fights Ali several times. Norton fights Larry Holmes. Norton fights Ernie Shavers. Norton fights Jimmy Young. Norton fights Jerry Cooney. Right? But you understood Norton was rarely the A side. Now, I don't have the financial data in front of me, and I understood. Of all the guys, Ali is by far the most global. Right? He's running the streets in Zaire, and then kids. And this is outside Ali's country. Kids start running alongside him. Right? In a scene that probably inspired that scene in Rocky. Right? The kids are running with the guy, and Ali at that moment is not the heavyweight champ. That's the pull of Ali. But of all the heavyweights out of the 1970s, right? And there's a moment where Larry Holmes owns most of downtown Easton, Pennsylvania, where he's from. Right? But I would argue that of all the boxers from the 1970s, George Foreman, believe it or not, was the guy who ended up with the most money. Because George Foreman comes back, different person. This is the preacher. Right? This is the guy who has a need to talk to kids. Right? He has a need to tell you that Sonny Liston could not read. He has a need to tell you that while he's friendly, while kids flock to George Foreman, who came back. This is the opposite of the 70s. Right? He has a need to tell you that when he was a kid, he was a thug. He even goes so far as to talk about the Great Society and how the America he came up in was a compassionate America that gave him opportunities. Right, folks, I don't say this lightly. Foreman was a champ when he came back before he wins the title a second time. Right? That's a guy who's still a role model for me. This isn't a eulogy because Foreman will always live on for me. Let me point out, too, that Foreman with Ken Norton, with Ali, with Larry Holmes, Joe Frazier, they had a video they did called Champions Forever. And the claim was that while they were giving interviews, Frazier was still sore at Ali, who, of course, by this point was ravished by Parkinson's. So Frazier started calling him Clay, which Ali hated. Right? This is after everyone retired, right? These are former boxers. Well, is any boxer really a former boxer? These are old boxers who, are talking about their era and stuff like that. And they claim that Frazier was upset with Ali still. Right? Those guys had a dislike. Right? Understand they used to be friends, but then Ali betrayed Joe. Right? It's one thing to talk trash about a guy, to say, this guy can't knock me out. It's another to call the guy a gorilla and things like that. Right? To try to claim in the early 70s that the heavyweight champ was a Tom, when the heavyweight champ is giving you a shot at the title and you're not close to the mandatory. So Joe Frazier had it out for Ali even when they're making Champions Forever. And according to folklore, it's George Foreman who made sure that he was always by Joe's side to make sure that Joe couldn't get at Ali. And when Foreman started to get tired, it was Larry Holmes who would then stand next to Joe Frazier. Right? That's who George Foreman was. Right? His grill sold in part because it was George Foreman. And the Foreman who came back to boxing, people understood was a guy you wanted to support. Right? That grill made Foreman 9 figures. Right? That grill made the guy who couldn't get fights after the Rumble in the Jungle, big fights at least, apart from Ron Lyle, who was fighting everyone, right? Jerry Quarry, Joe Bugner, Ali, Ernie Shavers. It's that George Foreman who made the most money out of the 70s. Right? Just understand that he comes back, and it's when he comes back that he earns all the money. Right? He actually becomes a mogul. And this was the guy who, rather than just live in a mansion off at the side, felt the need to talk to young people, felt the need to be a boxing analyst. This is while he's making millions of dollars. Right? Felt a need to, be who he wasn't when he was heavyweight champ the first go round. I miss him. And it's been less than 24 hours. Those are my thoughts. Let me hear yours in the comment section of this YouTube video. If you get one takeaway from this, and you're a boxing fan, just understand, of everything that happened in the 1970s in the heavyweight division, in my eyes, the best heavyweight from that decade is unclear. It would be the winner of two of the best jabs I've seen, Holmes against Foreman. Right? Sadly, that fight never took place. That's how I see it. Let me hear from you, especially if you disagree with me, in the comment section of this YouTube video. Thanks for stopping by.